This week on Talking Politics, how Donald Trump has ripped up the rulebook.
America is back.
We have all grown up with a world order that we understood, and in 10 days, it's collapsed. The new world we find ourselves in.
My instinct is simply to go on the news and go, what the hell is this appalling person doing? But that wouldn't be impartial journalism.
Donald Trump constantly says, we're not going to help Europe anymore. Hello, when was the most recent wars in which soldiers went to help out? It was American wars.
And Paulie Roberts' dog brings us all a brief moment of salvation. Look at that. Oh, come on now. What a sweetie. Welcome to the podcast. Robert and Anushka are back with me, or rather I'm back with them after a few weeks away. And of course there is so much to talk about. We'll be discussing Trump, the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the tariffs trade war, plus Anushka has an exclusive insight on government spending, which will affect us all. I mean, it's been a heck of a week, so I guess why don't we begin with sort of personal reactions. I should say I was giving a talk in a school yesterday, and a young lad, maybe he was 16 years old, came up to me at the end rather quietly, and he said, can I just ask you, is there going to be a war? Am I going to be conscripted? Am I going to have to fight? And I just drove home afterwards so sobered by that conversation, partly because I suspect it was impossible to see the last week and think of the US as a reliable ally, as it is now, of the UK and indeed of Europe, which means NATO's probably dead as a realistic force. And certainly we're going to have to look to our own protection in Europe. And then I guess we'll discuss later what Russia's ambitions really are. What about you two? What are you know, Robert, you first. Sorry, Robert's feeling terrible, so he's powered through to do this. Robert, thank you for that. But what's your own reflection on the last week?
So I hope I don't cough uncontrollably in the course of this programme. One of shock. I mean, let's just start with the big picture. What we have seen from Trump is the ripping up of the rules and norms that have basically delivered, undreamed of levels of global prosperity and security over the last half century. He has broken effectively the pact for mutual security between Europe and America by refusing to supply arms to Ukraine, and that pact with Europe has existed since the Second World War. And then secondly, he has shredded free trade by imposing tariffs on Mexico, Canada, China, three most important trading partners of the United States. And we're now in an era of protectionism, which will make everybody poorer. And then finally, there is this idea now prevailing at the top of government that American lives are the only ones that matter. And, we're already seeing risks to lives, particularly of impoverished people in Africa, in the way that America is abandoning the the aid to them. So it's been an unbelievably troubling few days. Later on, I can tell you what I think the silver lining in all of this may be, but we might as well focus on the horror at the start.
I don't know. I feel like we should get the silver lining early on. Come on, cheer us up.
Go on, what's the silver lining?
Okay, well, the silver lining is in sort of three parts. One is I was at Lancaster House on Sunday when Keir Starmer convened European leaders plus Trudeau. God, goodness only knows why he didn't invite the Baltic states. That was a sort of embarrassing mistake, but let's park that to one side. There was a solidarity between all the leaders, but in this case, between a British Prime Minister and European leaders that I have not witnessed since Brexit. And I personally take the view that this solidarity when it comes to defence will translate into a greater willingness on the part of our European partners to revisit our commercial relationship with the EU, which I think will also be a benefit. Silver lining number two, well, these are points 2 and 3. Effective abandonment of Europe, I think, will have two beneficial impacts. One is it's been obvious for years that we're not spending enough on defence and we have an inadequate arms industry. That is now being corrected at a rate of knots, which is a good thing. And secondly, it's been obvious for years that throughout Europe, including the UK, we don't have the right policies to generate growth and prosperity. And again, Trump abandoning us, I think, will force all EU leaders as well as the UK to really grip this growth problem. We've moved into this era of global gangsterism with the great gangsters in Washington, Moscow and Beijing. Europe needs to be the counterpoint, the counterweight, the continent that basically shows that democratic values are work and are an alternative. But I think there is, just a general sense throughout Europe that the time for dithering and assuming things will get better is over. And we really need to grip this with some bold policies that up to now have been wholly wanting.
Well, I think there's a lot to talk about there, and we will talk about it. Anushka, I wanted to ask you, let's face it, for all of us, it has been a head-spinning week. We have all grown up with a world order that we understood, that seemed stable, Western security underpinned by the Atlantic Alliance, and in 10 days, it's collapsed.
I mean, head-spinning, totally. I was actually here in the newsroom when Zelensky was meeting Trump, and we were standing around the TVs in a way that you only do once every few years, once every 10 years or more, open-jawed, seeing what was happening. I was speaking to people in Downing Street. They were in the exact same state, trying to work out how on earth they responded to that. There is the opportunity that Robert's talking about. When I don't know if sometimes you read a bit too much into a picture, but I saw a picture of Keir Starmer standing at the front of the group, and the rest of the group were behind him, and Ursula von der Leyen was behind him, and she had this little wry smile on her face. And to me, looking at Keir Starmer, I thought they're thinking, Europe's back in a way. We're back together. The UK, almost like all this, the conversation that you and Robert are obsessed with. Are we ever going to rejoin the EU? It feels almost irrelevant now, because it feels like there is another kind of reason why that group matters. And actually, there's quite a few more defence experts in Parliament than there have been previously, partly because Keir Starmer brought in 14 former military types. But actually, I was speaking to a Lib Dem MP, Mike Martin, yesterday, who used to be a soldier and then a defence expert, about the same sort of things. And he's been making the arguments, which I think we'll hear more and more, which is, OK, if NATO doesn't exist in the way that it used to exist, and it very much seems like that is the direction we could be going in, what is left, and how does Europe create this alternative defence grouping, which, let's be fair, Keir Starmer said from the start of his premiership, a defence pact was something that he wanted with Europe. And what are, as Robert mentioned, the potential growth benefits to that, because at the moment we have all these different militaries using different types of equipment, no kind of procurement across it, no agreement that we're going to buy stuff within Europe. So that's all potentially positive. But then also, in preparation for the Peston programme, I've been looking at some of the data, trying to work out, well, if there is a world war and it doesn't involve the US on our side, what do the militaries look like? And, you're stacking up the US there and pushing it off to one side. Then you've got Russia, which is big and getting bigger because Vladimir Putin has put huge amounts of money into growing his armed forces. And then I'm blocking up the UK, France, the Baltic states, Finland. Should I, for example, add on Italy and Germany? They're not sure if they want to add in peacekeeping troops. And you sort of almost can't believe that that's where we're at and that that's what we're looking at.
I tell you what, one sidebar thing. I'm not sure that my sort of friendship group, for want of putting it a different way, are not very interested in politics. I've never seen them so incensed about anything or so angry with anyone as much as they were with J.D. Vance's throwaway comments about some random country that hasn't fought a war. Many of them know people, have family members who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of them died. Some of them saw their soldiers bleed out. And they're so incensed.
And, this is a really big point, right? Donald Trump constantly says, we're not going to help Europe anymore. Hello? When was the most recent wars in which soldiers went to help out? It was American wars. It was Iraq. It was Afghanistan. And actually, this same MP I was talking to yesterday, he'd fought in those, wars. He'd seen colleagues die. fighting for the Americans. And so, yeah,
well, there's a poll out today that suggests where people in France have been asked, do they consider the US an ally? And it's like over 70% clear no, it's 20-something% yes. I mean, that sort of tells you where we've got to in only 10 days. You insult all your allies. I mean, I'm really curious about this.
Hang on, Tom, just on that. Historically, France has always maintained its cultural and political independence from America in the way that Britain hasn't. So let's be clear. Although that is worrying, the extent to which French people don't regard America as an ally, they have always been much warier of the US.
Okay.
The baseline is different. But also there's one other thing, because I don't want to just brush over the concerns of the young person who you spoke to in a school. You cannot, in this hugely fragile time, rule out the idea that the UK will find itself directly at war with possibly a Russia. Right now, it is very important to focus on precisely what Starmer is trying to achieve here. The only conditions on which Starmer has said he will deploy British troops to Ukraine are the conditions, which frankly look unlikely at the moment, which are the conditions in which Trump gives a security guarantee that American planes and intelligence and missiles will be available if Putin were to breach a peace deal. And since there is a strong likelihood that Trump is not going to give that security guarantee, I think the more likely outcome of where we are at the moment is that poor old Ukraine is left to fight this on its own and eventually surrenders. And in essence, what we're looking at right now is the most likely, very depressing outcome of all of this, is that Ukraine does become a sort of vassal client state. It won't be fully occupied by Russia, but it will, there'll be a puppet put into Ukraine, and it'll have the same status as Belarus.
Well, listen,
that is a very depressing outcome, but it probably means that British soldiers will not be actively engaged and put in harm's way in that part of the world.
Okay, well, I just want to talk about people's concerns a little bit more. We've got a graph to show you. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you won't be able to see the graph, but I'm just going to talk you through it. And it is to do with the fact that searches for World War III in the UK over the last 7 days have absolutely spiked. For listeners, what we're looking at is a blue line which goes dramatically up last Friday amid the disastrous Trump-Zelensky meeting, and it's continued to fluctuate in the days since. We also asked the audience about their concerns this morning, and we got hundreds within minutes, including this from Bob Clark on Facebook, which seems to speak for many. I'm worried about me and my family being launched into a war that has very little to do with us. I'm worried at how many people are happy for us to go in and agitate things further, leaving us in a dangerous position that I don't want to be in. Now, people are concerned. That's just obvious. Everyone we speak to is frightened. A government minister's frightened.
I mean, I think very frightened, government ministers and senior officials. I mean, I'm trying to think of someone who's a senior official in government who I was talking to on the night of the Zelensky-Trump showdown. And they were saying to me, we literally have no idea what's going to happen next. We do not know. And to people who are not worrying about this, their response was, you weren't in Munich, you weren't in Washington. And when they were, I mean, obviously you were in Washington, Robert, but when they were sitting there at the Munich Security Conference, when they heard J.D. Vance talk about what felt like the end of the transatlantic alliance, they were genuinely quite terrified. And everything that we're talking about has changed, yeah? The whole kind of framing of how we think about things, the absolute consensus with everyone, probably apart from Jeremy Corbyn, that defence spending needs to go up, with all the consequences that come with that. It is sort of, although there was one resignation, it is sort of unbelievable that there was almost no fuss about, the international aid budget being absolutely torn apart to spend on defence spending. But that is partly because people are seeing this as such a frightening new time. Although I think that question's really fascinating, because one of the reasons America's pulling back is because the population think Ukraine's miles away, it's nothing to do with us. And actually, I increasingly hear that from people here, from when I've spoken to people who are, through our reporting, who still feel, even though we're in the same continent, that Ukraine's a long way away. And one thing I've heard say, Russia doesn't care about Britain. That's what they think. They think Russia's not going to invade Britain, so we don't have to worry about it. Right now, this is all going well for Keir Starmer. He looks like a statesman, but he's also going to come up against the fact that that sentiment that we're seeing in America exists here as well.
I've got a couple of quick questions about that, but Robert, can I just ask you? There is a bit of me that has watched everything that Starmer and you've been shuttling to and fro across the Atlantic. You look exhausted. You're ill, so thank you for pressing on through it. It clearly is exhausting, but the reality is, some people think, and I'm occasionally inclined to think, that there's a lot of denialism in the government. Standing back and looking what's happened over the last 10 days, it just looks to me that NATO is dead and the Atlantic Alliance is dead. That doesn't seem to be what Keir Starmer thinks. Now, maybe he's just buying time until Europe can get its act together. What do you make of that?
I think he's buying time until Europe gets its act together. I mean, he rightly takes the view that if he can persuade Trump to change his position and to sustain, even if it's just for a while, American support to, for Europe's security, while we rearm, while we increase the sizes of our military, while we invest in indigenous arms manufacturing companies, then that is plainly a better route than a rupture now, given, as I say, how deeply under-resourced in security terms the whole of Europe is, including the UK. And it also just politically, we talked about this before, it definitely plays well with the electorate for the UK to try and have a constructive relationship with America, whoever's in the White House, for all that huge numbers of British people are just horrified by the kind of things that Trump and Vance are saying and doing. So I don't believe, therefore, that Starmer is naive, for all that quite a lot of what he says publicly sounds naive. Because, when he says, as he, I think, has again just now, that he believes Donald Trump when Donald Trump says that he's got our back. That obviously sounds incredibly naive. Hours after Donald Trump withdraws military support for Ukraine, it is basically the sort of thing you have to say just to keep the show on the road. And so, in general, he sort of faces the same dilemma as, you, me and Anushka face when we go on the news after the latest shocking decision by Trump. My instinct, when, Trump withdraws support from Ukraine, or imposes these massive prosperity-destroying tariffs, is simply to go on the news and go, what the hell is this appalling person doing? But that wouldn't be impartial journalism. So I don't do that. And what I try and do is analyse it in a calm way. And, in politics, he has to behave in the same kind of way.
Anushka, every defence expert you talk to says we're going to, if what Robert is talking about, we're going to need to build a European defence force, whether it's not going to be a European defence force, it's going to be national forces that operate together. Everyone says that's going to require us, France, Germany and the other big countries to spend 5% of GDP. Give us a sense of, that's another 80 billion a year, I think I'm right in saying, in us.
Does everyone say 5? I think the more realistic thing I think people are talking about is at least 3. Yeah.
But let's say 5 if we really wanted to take on Russia. What's credible that we'd ever get there? Give us a sense of what kind of trade-offs we're talking about.
I mean, enormous trade-offs, right? We've had a peace dividend since the end of the Second World War. You can literally see it on the charts. Defence spending comes down, health spending, social security spending soars. That has completely changed, even if we don't go as far as 5%. If we go as far as 5%, then you're looking for really an overhauling of how we think about government. They're going one by one at the moment for the areas which are most popular to go after. So international aid is by far the thing people say cut first. Welfare is next, and we know they're going to cut billions and billions from welfare. But they're going to have to go further than that if they really want to get to 5%. And it's the speed at which they want to get to it. You know, I genuinely don't think Keir Starmer wanted to massively reduce international aid. But once he'd made a decision that by 27 we would get to 2.5% of GDP, which, by the way, is only a tiny increase from where we are, they quickly had to find something, and they decided that was the most palatable way to do it. Obviously, lots of Labour MPs disagree with that, and I still think it will cause some friction. But yeah, it's really, really difficult.
There is an argument that we will have to get to 5. It depends very much on the extent to which the threats from Russia, potentially over the next 2 or 3 years, China, if it decides, as you know, frankly, many security experts believe it is going to, in 2027, attempt to take Taiwan by force. You know, this is a very scary and unstable world. In that kind of world, the normal economics doesn't necessarily apply. Okay, what is the constraint on ramping up to 5% spending on defense at the moment? It is debt levels that investors are and governments are anxious about. Actually, in that kind of global security crisis, you could easily envisage a world. You could easily envisage a world in which countries come together and they collectively decide that they are going to completely restructure all that debt on a much more long-term basis. Investors would then take a hit. If everybody does it together, then actually debt becomes affordable for everybody. And at that point, you can spend and invest a hell of a lot more. You have to do it on a globally coordinated basis. But all of that stuff becomes possible when you are effectively at war.
I just want to take in a little bit of President Trump's, I think what you would say, pretty bellicose America First speech to Congress.
America is back. I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which is headed by Elon Musk, who is in the gallery tonight.
Members are directed to uphold and maintain decorum in the House and to cease any further disruption. Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
Other countries have used tariffs against us for decades, and now it's our turn to start using them against those other countries. Earlier today, I received an important letter from President Zelensky of Ukraine. The letter reads, "Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer." I appreciate that he sent this letter, just got it a little while ago. We've had serious discussions with Russia and have received strong signals that they are ready for peace. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Wouldn't that be beautiful?
When I sat down and listened to it, and this is the stuff we're not really talking about, but the sort of first 20 minutes or so is all about his anti-woke agenda, the anti-trans agenda, the anti-diversity and inclusion agenda, the cutting back on government spending, which was really all about cutting back on helping poor people around the world. And he was almost like parodying these schemes that were obviously about trying to help people. And I just when you heard it all together, I just suddenly realised, which I think I always knew, how much this is a response to Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the attempt by women and black people to sort of have their selves heard being completely and utterly torn down by American people, including Donald Trump. And, and on diversity and inclusion, I always find it quite frustrating because if it was obviously a completely meritable system, then how come only white men are in charge of everything? Because that suggests they've got a lot more ability and credit, than everyone else. And obviously, I'm not saying that there's no problems with diversity and inclusion programs, but the idea of them is not to have a system that does not run on merit. The idea is to unlock some of the barriers to certain groups.
Well, as was said around I think Robert Moore said around the inauguration, it's MAGA with swagger at the moment, and that's where you see everywhere, that's kind of was underpinned JD Vance's throwaway comments that many people found so offensive. But I guess the question is, will MAGA undermine itself? And I guess the most likely way it will do it is on the economy. Trump's economic approval ratings, Robert, are starting to track down. So I guess the big question is, are these tariffs going to stuff the American economy? What do you think?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's not just approval ratings turning down. The Atlanta branch of the US Federal Reserve does these nowcasts. That's it. That's based on real-time data of the state of the American economy. A couple of weeks ago, it was saying that in the first quarter of this year, first 3 months of this year, the American economy was growing at an annualized rate of 3%, which is very healthy. And it is broadly where the American economy was before Trump became president. And the Atlanta Fed's latest assessment is that it is now shrinking at a rate of 3%. Now, that 6% swing is, just off the charts dramatic. And it's because it's partly because of all the uncertainty. So Trump, announces that he's going to do lots of stuff and then doesn't do it. And, investors, consumers don't like uncertainty. Sorry, I keep looking down because I've got a whining dog here that I'm trying to keep under control so I can continue with the podcast. A dog that's very anxious about Trump. Anyway, they don't like uncertainty and they definitely don't like tariffs. Just to remind people how tariffs operate, when a tariff is imposed, let's say 25%, which it is in the case of Canada, what then happens is the importer either has to absorb the 25% tax in its, out of its own revenue. That means much lower profits for the importer, or they pass them on to customers, which could be consumers or other businesses, and that's inflation. And in the case of, and for, American citizens, that's a squeeze on living standards. This is a president who was elected on the basis of an attack on Biden and Harris for undermining living standards in America, and that is precisely what he's doing at the moment. So there is an interesting issue around how many of his supporters will continue to back him if what appears to be a ferocious attack on Americans' living standards at his behest through these tariffs is sustained.
Robert, we're going to need to see your dog at this stage. I'm sorry about that. But, you've introduced your dog. I feel like national star. Oh, look at that. Oh, come on now. Maybe scared of Trump, but what a sweetie. Anushka, you've got some insight into what's going to happen here on spending, difficult economic times.
Well, even before we had the pressure on defence, there was massive pressure on Rachel Reeves as Chancellor in order to meet her own fiscal rules, to cut spending in a spring statement and then a spending review that we're going to have quite shortly. And just talking to kind of senior figures in government, I first got told that one department had been asked to identify the 20% lowest priority spending in their department, which I thought sounded like quite a lot. I mean, it doesn't mean they're going to cut the lot, but it means they want to know what's the 20% that's least important. I then spoke to another senior figure in another department who had the same story to tell, and then in a third department again. And when I spoke to someone in Downing Street, they really didn't push against it, saying absolutely we want to see departments deprioritise their spending. We know this comes alongside billions of pounds of cuts of welfare that are going to come pretty soon. They're going to be published in a green paper on health and disability benefits. A green paper is meant to be a consultation paper, which you put out, you consult on, and then you decide to go ahead on it, i.e. it's not supposed to be scored in the spring statement, because in theory you haven't decided when you put out a consultation paper. But I now understand that parts of that package are going to be scored in the spring, even though it is a green paper. They are huge changes to both the work capability assessment and also personal independence payments, which disabled people get to help with the additional cost of being disabled, wheelchairs, other kind of mobility aids and so on. And just worth saying, I also saw something today that was quite interesting. Rishi Sunak almost means tested PIP, personal independence payments, but he pulled back from the brink at the very last moment because of, and I've seen kind of documents that actually show this, his aide said to him that it was crazy to do this because it was, the optics of it were going to be absolutely terrible to take things like wheelchairs and mobility aids off something like 1 million disabled people. But the government has said it's actually going to go quite a lot further than the previous government went on any of this. And that comes alongside departments being told to find this 20%, which I've been told suggests very nasty cuts in other areas. It is worth saying someone in the Treasury said they didn't recognise the 20% figure, so i.e. it's not an all-government thing, but they did, stress that, of course, governments have been asked to do a zero, what's it called now? A zero review of every line of spending, basically, in the departments.
Okay, it's called a zero-based review, yeah, which we haven't seen since, I think, 2008 or 2009.
Listen, we're sort of running out of time, so I think let's just give a final thought. Let me go first, and then I'll come to both of you. I would say that what we've seen, I've been in this business 35 years. I have never seen anything as dramatic in terms of the shift in the world order that we've seen the last 10 days. I suspect many people, including some in our government and many people in the country, haven't entirely accepted that change and may not, but it seems to me pretty obvious that the Atlantic Alliance and NATO is effectively dead. I think it's inconceivable to imagine that this American president or any American president like him would come to the aid of an Estonia if it was attacked by Russia, which of course is a NATO member, and therefore we've got to just accept that. Not all of it is bad. Europe may get its act together and all the rest of it. I suspect there probably will be a peace deal ultimately in Ukraine because I don't think the Ukrainians are going to have much choice, and that will give Putin a chance to, regroup, reboot, re-equip his army, get his economy back on its feet, perhaps with American support. And then the real test for us will be 3, 5, 7 years when he starts to expand again. And, the question to me is, do we have the wherewithal with France, with Germany, to get ourselves in a position between now and that moment where we can defend ourselves properly and we're not even bothering with the Americans because we know they're going to get involved? So that's where I think we are. Robert, next.
Look, I think if the time horizon is 3 to 5 years, and like you, I think that is probably the central sensible forecast, then yes, we absolutely can get ourselves in the right kind of shape by then. I mean, one of the big imponderables, just to be clear, is how much support Trump gives to Putin to rebuild the Russian economy. The Russian economy is hobbled at the moment. I think, on pretty much every scenario, that there is a sustainable peace settlement with Ukraine. I think that's probably least likely at the moment, through to, sadly, Ukraine is degraded into some kind of client vassal state of Russia. Nonetheless, Russia is in no position at the moment. It's suffered, huge loss of life, huge depletion of its military resources, and huge damage to its economy. It's going to take, Russia does need to rebuild. One of the things we're all therefore going to be looking very, very closely at is, given that, Trump plainly has, just extraordinary positive feelings towards Putin and Russia, quite what, the nature of this relationship between America and Russia is going to be in coming months, and if sanctions are lifted, and whether Trump does various commercial deals with Russia that helps Putin to become strong. All of this is terrifying, incredibly important. But fundamentally, I think Europe, yes, can take charge of its own destiny with the right resolve among its leaders. Starmer has the kind of majority in Parliament, and indeed at the moment cross-parliamentary support for what he's doing, and he's got 3 or 4 years to, get Britain in shape. Merz, has, he hasn't got the kind of majority that Starmer has, but on the basis that he does a sensible deal with the SPD, he's definitely massively changing Germany's position into essentially getting Germany, whether it's in respect of autonomous defence capability and indeed regeneration of the German economy. He's saying the right kind of things. Big uncertainty around France because of the instability of the parliament, albeit, Macron is under no personal threat for a while. So I would say, yeah, look, I am cautiously, in a terrible, depressing world, I'm cautiously optimistic, as I said at the start, that this is Europe's moment to regenerate.
Anushka, final word today to you.
It wasn't that long ago that we talked about leaflets in Sweden and Finland and actually Germany as well in looking for citizens to prepare for World War III. And I think the response, not by us, but largely to that, was that it was almost a bit silly. And nobody would say that now. Everybody absolutely accepts that the threat is huge and extremely scary, particularly for those countries which are close to the border. Just a final real thought on Keir Starmer, though. He has had a very bad first 6 months as Prime Minister. He had a huge number of domestic problems. His personal ratings absolutely plummeted. And it's very clear that he sees an opportunity here, and it looks so far to be working quite well, to take quite a statesman-like role, to act as a bridge between Europe and between the US. And at the moment, that appears to be have the potential to transform his premiership. Although that said, speaking to senior figures around him, they are not taking too much from it because they basically say everything is so volatile and unpredictable. Who knows where we're going?
OK, that is sadly all we've got time for now. Get well soon, Robert. You really do look like you need a bit of a rest. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back with Talking Politics USA on Monday.